Speaking in December of 2022 here with James Fleay. He is from Down Under Nuclear. We're picking apart some of the comments from some of the political leaders in Australia about nuclear. James, how are you going today?
Well, thanks, Ricky, and you?
All right, thank you. Look, let's just firstly, background listeners, you've spoken with us before about the nuclear conversation, as we call it here on Flow. What's your skin in the game in terms of nuclear energy in Australia?
Sure. So our organisation was set up to advocate and educate for nuclear energy to be considered as part of Australia's energy mix. We've been doing that for 4 years, and we think it's essential. We don't think we can remain a prosperous industrial nation without nuclear energy as part of our future energy mix as coal exits.
And if I recall correctly from our previous conversation, you're someone who's come to this decision that nuclear needs to be considered as someone who, you had some interest or involvement with renewables and other energy sources, and you realised this needed to be part of the mix.
Absolutely. Actually, I came to the realisation when I was trying to develop a solar project that there was some reasons in our financial model that we just couldn't get the project to work in the end. But that started a deep dive as to some of the I would say lesser known paradoxes with renewable energy and the claims about it being cheap unfortunately are only half true. And I've also spent much of my career working in the oil and gas sector, particularly upstream gas, and so I understand other energy sources intimately, and I just don't think they're going to be adequate by themselves to get us to net zero.
Well, earlier this week, the South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas and he and I had a conversation on air about nuclear as well in late November, but he was talking about the AUKUS arrangement, Australia, UK and the US, regarding nuclear submarines as a potential foot in the door to look at what nuclear energy could do for South Australia. The direct comments he told News Limited was he's always thought the ideological opposition in some quarters to nuclear power is ill-founded. He said nuclear power is a source of baseload energy with zero carbon emissions, and he said he's dedicated to a decarbonisation effort, so he felt that we should be open-minded to technologies and it would be foolhardy to have a different approach. What's your reaction to those comments?
It sounds very sensible. I mean, you really can't fault anything he said there. He's wanting to have a sensible discussion by the sound of it, grow public awareness, maybe allay public concern. So I think that's perfect.
But things got a bit spicy thereafter, because you got Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was on radio the next day saying he's got a great deal of respect for the South Australian Premier, but everyone's entitled to get things wrong. The Prime Minister said every 5 years or so we have an economic analysis, he claimed, of whether nuclear power stacks up, and every time it's rejected. Is he on the right track there, the Prime Minister?
No, and this might be one of those occasions where the Prime Minister himself is allowed to get one wrong every now and again. The truth is we don't have an economic analysis every 5 years into the viability of nuclear energy. We usually have a little bit of an inquiry prompted by, usually by backbenchers. We get the same people from the same federal government bodies coming out and saying, we don't need it, it's too far away, it's too expensive, with very little evidence to back those claims up. And they don't seem to take stocktake of how the technology is changing. And they also don't seem to take stocktake of the fact that France, the UK, the United States, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and that list goes on and on and on, are all saying and acting toward, have acknowledged that there is no decarbonisation that's going to be possible in advanced industrial nations without nuclear energy. And so they're all, extending the life of old reactors, building new reactors, looking at new designs that are more economical. So we're a bit of a laggard down under.
And I notice as well, there's been a whole lot of commentary. I know Victoria's Premier Daniel Andrews has talked about being 100% renewable energy by, I think it's even sooner than 2050, but getting off of, I guess, the fossil fuel scenario. As I understand it, the amount of projects that are proposed around the world, we're not going to get close to getting off of fossil fuels for a very long time to come. So doesn't that mean nuclear needs to be considered in the mix, as many other countries are?
Absolutely. I mean, there is no analysis, engineering analysis, nor is there an example of an advanced industrial nation without truly massive quantities of hydro being able to go to 100% renewables. We don't have a successful example. What we do have is really serious attempts by the likes of California and Germany, which have come up short, woefully short. And so there's reason to be sceptical that we can ever get to 100% solar and wind. That's why in our conversations that we've been having, we've been trying to make people aware of the fact that this is not a sort of scenario where we pick technology winners. It's like as if it's some sort of popularity contest. Nor is it a scenario where policymakers have got a range of, more or less equal options, and they just can sort of choose the one that's most palatable to voters. We truly don't believe, nor do many other nations, that it is possible to remain the kind of nation we are without nuclear energy in our future.
Well, I notice in the response to the Premier Peter Malinauskas' comments in South Australia, the National Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek said that nuclear was slow to build and really expensive. She claimed all this nonsense, I'm quoting here, about small-scale nuclear reactors in every suburb. I don't think if there's people up your street who want a nuclear reactor in the local park, I really don't think that's the case. So what do you rate of those comments?
Well, I've never heard of a suburban nuclear reactor, so I'm not. I would agree with her that that's nonsense. I'm not sure where she got that from, but the environment minister could do well to look at the example of the UAE, for example. They started in 2008. They made a decision that we're going to pursue a nuclear energy program. They're a country with a far less sophisticated industry and industrial workforce than Australia. And by 2019, 2020 rather, they had first electrons on the grid for their first plant. And so you said, okay, well, it took them 11 years from the time they made a decision to the time they got electrons. But then we look and we go, but 1 year after that, they had the second reactor online. 2 years after that, they had the third reactor online. 4 years after that, which is this year, the fourth reactor will be online. And so, 25% of their electricity will be carbon-free nuclear in under 15 years from making that decision. And that's an extraordinarily deep and fast decarbonisation playbook, and it's worked for numerous countries. So if your time horizon is an election cycle, I understand why it may seem slow, but if you're taking investments over 40, 60, even 100 years, well, it's just a no-brainer to use a technology that scales up actually really quite quickly.
And this business, she says, I don't know who's talking about small-scale reactors in every suburb. That sounds a bit alarmism to me. But the serious conversation is about, say, the mining industry or parts of remote Australia having small modular reactors in those locations. I mean, isn't that really what the nuclear conversation has started to zero in on, is we're not looking at large-scale plants like other countries have built or will be building. It's these small-scale ones to put energy where it's needed in energy-intensive industries.
Well, there's a couple of things there, Ricky. First is there is a class of reactor that's on the drawing board, and some of them are sort of deep into prototyping phase, which would be well suited for remote operations for things like mine sites. These tend to be closer to what we call a micro reactor, in the 1 to 15 megawatt scale, and I think there's a enormous potential future in Australia and also other places around the world for microreactors. But in terms of our national electricity grid, that's a different class of reactor we're looking at. And I would say that's better considered a medium-sized. They're called small, but they're really a medium-sized reactor, and they can be deployed relatively quickly, not as quickly as the microreactors, which roll off a truck and get set up. They still take a few years to build, but so there's two classes of reactors there. There's the micro, and then there's a sort of small to medium-sized grid-connected reactor, and Australia really needs to be looking at both. The large reactors are terrific. They're very safe, and by countries with really countries with really enormous electricity grids and interconnections to adjacent countries, they make a lot of sense. I wouldn't rule them out in Australia one day, but they're also quite a substantial risk to undertake as a first project, with project delays and licensing and siting. So I don't think they're appropriate for Australia initially.
But so it's a small modular, or what, in that range, that micro range is what might have more immediate possibilities in Australia, I gather. And how soon could those potentially be rolled out from where we are at the prototype stage?
Well, unfortunately, in Australia, we couldn't roll them out very quickly at all. We haven't started work on doing going through the IAEA milestones approach to stand up our regulatory infrastructure. So Australia just doesn't have an option to go nuclear quickly because we've failed to prepare. The first micro reactor is scheduled to be deployed to US Air Force Base in 2025. And that will be a Westinghouse design. We've been working on that since I think about 2008, and that will be a terrific test case. 2025 is not far away at all. And there are other technologies slightly bigger in scale, which are the Canadians are building actually, Ultra Safe Nuclear Corporation. So I think that's not too far away. That'll be sort of late 2020s.
Yeah, and James, just on that point you make about we're not ready yet, it's really a question of political will, and that's why we've zeroed in at the start of this conversation about the comments of a South Australian Premier and the Prime Minister and the Environment Minister is if the will was to develop more around what Premier Peter Malinauskas has said, that we could actually get started if we remove the blockages in parliaments.
Absolutely. The UAE, a tiny little nation, was able to build 4 very large reactors in cooperation with the Koreans in, I think, a 13-year period or 11-year period, whatever it was. I think 11 till the first one was built, 13 today. And Australia could move faster. We have a nuclear regulator already for our Lucas Heights reactor.
Which incidentally is situated in the suburbs of Sydney, despite what the Environment Minister said about them being situated in suburbs.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, we have a skilled workforce. We have tradespeople and engineers and other project professionals who have got experience with very large, complex projects. So this is certainly not beyond us. We could move more quickly than most nations, but we have to start. And I think the comments of the South Australian Premier are absolutely spot on. A sensible, non-ideological conversation about the merits of nuclear energy as part of a mix. I should say that as well, Ricky. We occasionally get asked, well, if we can't go 100% solar and wind, can we go 100% nuclear? And our response is always the same. 100% nuclear energy is only slightly less absurd than 100% solar and wind. It needs to be part of an intelligent mix of technologies.
Well, James Fleay from Down Under Nuclear, if people want to do their own research and find out a bit more information, what's your website address so they can drill deeper?
downundernuclearenergy.com.au is our website. We've got some material up there and you can get in contact with us.
Great stuff. Thanks again, James, for joining us today, and you have yourself a Merry Christmas as well.
And you, Ricky. Thanks for your time.